Hey guys, we're back. We had Freddie New, who is the CEO of the Bitcoin Policy Institute, here with us today. And it was a great chat because we spoke about not only his Bitcoin rabbit hole story, which was an interesting one, but also we spoke about CBDCs and the work that the Bitcoin Policy UK are doing, trying to work with policymakers and the government to educate them on Bitcoin and the value that it really has in society. What else did we speak about, Joel?
We had actually it was quite a nice format today where we sort of had a back and forth with a guest as
That's
well.
true. Yeah,
That was
that
cool.
was nice. That was nice because he was asking us questions, we was asking him questions. It just felt like a little chat, really, and that was really nice. It's probably the first time we've done something like that in this way. So I hope you guys enjoy the format of this and give us some feedback on it. And if you like it, we'll just continue doing it that way as well. You know, we want to be led by you guys, so please give us some feedback. And without further ado, let's go down this Bitcoin rabbit hole with Freddie New. Hello and welcome back to yet another episode of Rabbit Hole Stories. Today we have the fantastic Freddie New with us. Hey Freddie, how are you?
Hey, Ian, thank you very much for having me on. Hi, Joel.
Hi, Freddie.
How are you
So
guys?
yeah, we're living the dream. This week's been an absolute hot week, and I was just saying before, wasn't I, Freddie, how we just love to complain about the weather here, but you know, it's been fantastic. It's been long overdue, and I think it's brightened everyone's week this week, and I hope it continues for a little while yet. What about you? What
100%.
you like with the weather, Joel? What are you saying about the hot weather this week?
It's better if it's hot than it's raining, I guess, but like
Yeah.
we'll just take day by day. I'm Swiss.
Yeah.
I try to keep it very neutral.
Freddie, thank you for joining us today. We've got you on the show because we would love to learn about how you got into Bitcoin, why you stayed, and what is it you're doing now in the Bitcoin space. So maybe we can just kick off with that and see where we go.
Of course. Well, I mean, before we kick off, thank you so much for having me on the show. I've listened to a bunch of your episodes. I have quite a long drive as part of my job at the moment, so I've had your. It's very strange actually seeing your faces on screen because often your voice is playing on my car stereo. So it's. But thank you. So how would you like me to start off? Shall I start off with sort of rough chronology of dialing back into the past and setting out how I first got interested in?
Yeah, I mean, what we find is sometimes people's Bitcoin rabbit hole story starts way before they actually discover Bitcoin, if that makes sense. Sometimes, you know, people's childhood plays a part in their journey into Bitcoin. So it's just a matter of where you think is a poignant place to start. It could be anywhere. So it's, you know, whatever
up
you
to
feel
you.
is relevant.
That's a nice jumping off point, and probably something we'll return to later in the chat. I reckon that I think some. A lot of the people I know who are into Bitcoin have some experience of modern monetary theory or some form of economic collapse that I think has made it easier for them to understand the subject and to understand often understanding money rather than understanding the tech itself. But perhaps starting in a very dull place, I actually first heard about Bitcoin during the Cypriot banking crisis in 2013, which is hopefully people won't immediately switch off. But if it's as a rough recap, at the time I was working in a law firm in the city, and we were all very excited about the tailwinds coming out of the financial crisis and the Cypriot bank bail-in. So if any of your listeners haven't heard about what happened, very briefly, what happened in Cyprus was that effectively all depositors were required to contribute compulsorily some of the money that they had kept within Cypriot banks to bailing those banks out. So in other words, if you had 100 grand in the bank, then a certain percentage of that was diverted towards keeping that bank as a solvent entity. So I was writing a lot about briefing papers for clients, basically, in my role as a lawyer in the city at the time. And I can't actually remember the first time I came across Bitcoin, but it was in that context. And I suspect it was in terms of it being unconfiscatable, rather unlike all of the money that had been ostensibly safe in these Cypriot banks that was then suddenly impounded. And that I think planted the initial seed. And then I remembered hearing that the Winklevoss twins had bought some Bitcoin. So I thought, oh yeah, I might read about this stuff that these chaps seem interested in. And to my shame, about a year later, when Mt. Gox went down, I just remember thinking, oh, those guys properly stepped on a rake there, didn't they? They got completely shafted by Zuckerberg, and then they put their their money into Bitcoin, and then that slapped them in the face as well. Obviously, I was an idiot, but I imagine a lot of Bitcoiners have got the same kind of memory. And story. When did you first hear about it? Jamal, I don't actually know.
I heard about Bitcoin probably first time I heard about Bitcoin. It's one of those things. It's hard to actually pinpoint a particular time because when I first discovered it as a thing that I wanted to put my money into, I already knew of its existence. So it wasn't like what's this Bitcoin thing in 2017 when I first started to sort of scratch behind the surface a little bit. I didn't really actually invest in it until 2019 though. But I think I must have heard about it, I'm guessing around 2011. And I think it was when I was working in the Met Police as a police officer. And it was... I'm starting to remember a financial crime case that I can't remember the details about, and I wasn't involved in any way whatsoever. It was just sort of canteen banter at the time about this Bitcoin scam was going on, and I couldn't tell you any more about it because I wasn't really interested in it. It was all above my head, and that's I think when I linked it back to 2017 when I started looking into it. My first mindset of it was, oh, this thing must be for criminals because that narrative was already out there. Right, and I heard about it in this negative context about it being part of this criminal investigation a few years prior. So that's when I first heard about it, I think.
Yeah, I was 2011 as well, and I only knew about it because I wanted to book a flight illegally because my parents shouldn't see it on my bank account. So a friend of mine said,
you as a child trying to buy a flight, Joel.
I was 15.
You were, this is hilarious.
I mean,
I should.
There was an Occupy Wall Street thing in London. I wanted to go. Living in Switzerland, I had to take a flight. I could have taken a train, actually. I didn't think that far ahead, so, like, silly me. Then I ran into two issues. One was how to book the flight, because I was underage, technically speaking, like by a year. Except if you fly Ryanair, which I did. Ryanair didn't give a shit. They just sell the ticket. And then the second thing was like, oh, I don't want my parents to know, because like if I say I'm going to this mass protest to like show the middle fingers to the banks, they're gonna say no eventually. And my friend was like, yeah, that too. So like, there were other issues as well. And but yeah, he was like, hey, just bring me the money in cash for whatever you want. We'll go to one of these Bitcoin ATMs. I'll show you how to set up. I was like, cool. I then bought a voucher or something off another bloke, bought a ticket, forgot about it for 2 years, and in 2013 needed to pay someone in South Africa, so had to use it again and remembered.
Intelligence.
So we lost you to the internet.
So sorry, I was laughing extremely loudly, so potentially that was...
You pull it out of whack.
Yeah, it was a Joel's story about his underage flight booking. Excellent.
But yeah,
you guys should have slung 100 quid at it back in 2011. You'd be on an island somewhere by now. If only. But anyway, I keep on saying, the price is the least interesting thing about Bitcoin. It's not about the price. So yeah, and anyway, as we know, price jumped back up after 2014. So the Winklevoss twins were thankfully okay. And I didn't actually start getting involved in it until about 2015. So I'd always been a bit of a geek, and I was a gamer. I used to build gaming computers, and I just built this enormous water-cooled monster of a gaming computer. And I thought, I've been curious about Bitcoin for a while, poking around the edges, reading about it. I'm going to try mining it. And obviously, again, I was an idiot. By 2015, GPU mining had been impossible for... Well, exactly. So that didn't work. But I did get curious enough to start running a node, downloaded the full blockchain, and I realized the other day I started running a node before I bought any Bitcoin, which
All right.
I imagine must be quite rare now. Now that not that we don't want mass market adoption, which we do, but it was an interesting way of approaching it.
Was that more because you was interested in like the geeky tech type side of it rather than the actual
Initially,
monetary side?
Yeah. I just thought it was a fascinating idea, and I didn't. I mean, one of my big regrets is that I never learned how to code. I was a classicist. I read classics at university, Latin and Greek, and I think in another universe I would have really enjoyed doing computer science rather than humanities, but it's too late now.
Yeah.
But I enjoy tinkering.
I imagine Latin and stuff is essentially a different way of decoding things in a way, isn't it?
It's a good point. And people often say when you're constructing a Latin sentence, it's very much like creating a piece of code or a piece of logic. If you've done any Latin, it's extraordinarily beautiful in the way that the sentences are put together, and the way that you build up a piece of Latin prose or poetry is very similar in some ways to creating an if-then logic structure. So there's probably things about Latin that appeal to would appeal to people who can write code as well. So I ran that node for a while, and I thought, okay, well, I'm finally going to put my money where my mouth is. I'm going to buy something. I had a great plan. It was 2015, so I don't know if you remember, the price was like flat for like 2 years, and it came down off the Mount Gox, and then it was. So I thought I'm going to buy 1 Bitcoin a month every month for a year, because the price was like 150 quid back then, and then I forgot about that as well. I've only been speaking for 5 or 10 minutes, and I realised that I've just highlighted 3 instances where I was a complete idiot. So perhaps people shouldn't take my policy.
We've all taken those wrong turns down that rabbit hole. We really have.
Yeah, it's dark down there, isn't it? Yeah, so I started dabbling, forgot about it for a couple of years, and then kind of really returned to it during the block size wars, when obviously all of the Bitcoin media was going nuts. That was when I really began to pay attention, try to understand what was happening. It taught me what was going to happen to the Bitcoin that was on my node, and how to deal with it. How was it going to be safe? So Aaron Van Weerdem at the time, he put out a great explainer, and that was my first interaction with Bitcoin, between him to say thank you for reassuring the community as to what to do, because I had absolutely no idea at all what to do and how to cope. After that, I don't think I met my first real life Bitcoin until 2019. So spent quite a long time. I don't know if you guys found the same when you first got involved. I spent a long time on my own, not knowing anyone in the community, and let alone meeting anyone in real life. Was that similar for you guys, or?
For me, when I started actually putting my money where my mouth was, it was initially just making a blind bet on Bitcoin and a few of the other shitcoins as well, and not really sort of investing the time I should have to understand where I was putting my money. But I think once I thought, I really need to sort of learn a little bit more about where my money's going, I started switching to things like YouTube podcasts and things like that. I was even listening at one stage to bloody, what's his name, BitBoy and stuff like that. And I was in danger of falling down a very dark hole. But I got rescued by a few of the podcasts, the likes of Preston Pish and a few others, where there was a few points that they made about the difference between crypto and Bitcoin, where I was like, okay, it sparked my curiosity enough as to understand why that might be. And then that's when the lifeline came for me to crawl out that hole and just go into the Bitcoin rabbit hole instead. I don't know what it was like for you, Joel.
I was just thinking, funnily enough, I was always interested in Bitcoin because I used it for 4 years just to pay friends, buy some stuff online, like essentially growing up in like Switzerland. It's not like in the UK where you can get your bank account when you're like 16, be more or less on your own if you want to, with like all the neobanks and stuff. Like you're still pretty much condensed to your parents or like some guardian or whatever. So I use it as a payment rail, but I then, when I started freelancing, took on, crypto projects because I thought like, hey, Bitcoin is interesting, but like cryptos as well. And I got paid in a couple of tokens. Like I got introduced to stable coins and these things, but they were never interesting enough for me to like keep investing in them or something like this. And I remember living in the village where the Ethereum Foundation was founded. And this was sort of my first hint where I went, like how can something be claimed to be decentralized and then like 12 weird programming looking dudes with way too many parties at their homes usually talk about the finance future, or like at the computer of the world, I think was the topic. And like the whole city was in on it. Like everyone, I remember the, maybe it was the butcher or it was the bakery, but one of those had a shit ton of ETH from the pre-sale, and like they dumped it when it hit $30 or something before like the DAO hack or whatever. So, I sort of saw this and I went, well, that kind of sounds like insider trading. And like with Bitcoin, this wasn't possible because you had to work for it, right? So I always would, if I get paid by these crypto projects, eventually turn it into Bitcoin. Or just convert it to fiat and basically pay the bills. But I was never really interested in the whole thing. But like I was young, so like, if I were able to buy my stuff, I was happy.
The have to work for it point is crucially important, and that's certainly something that I think comes to you slowly. I'm sure this is common for a lot of Bitcoiners, but I went through endless cycles of feeling terribly worried about the environmental impact of Bitcoin and why does it burn so much electricity and would it ever transition to proof of stake, without, I think, connecting the dots and then understanding that money is too important for someone to be able to create arbitrarily out of thin air. And actually the fact that you need to work for Bitcoin and the fact that there is a cost to its production, which makes the time chain completely unforgeable and impenetrable, is absolutely a feature and is in some ways the most important feature of all. It means that no one can attack it, that no one can corrupt the ledger, that no one can change the order of transactions. And understanding that, took me a while. I've been tinkering around the edges of this for a decade now, and it took me a long time to understand. I think knowing how long it took me to understand it helps to remind me that we can't expect people who are new to the space to get this instantaneously.
Yes.
It's hard often when I talk to pre-coiners to get them to understand this, because most people, in fairness, and why would most people know or care how money is created and how it is manipulated and destroyed? It's not something that you necessarily want to spend much time thinking about. And why should you?
And I mean, you said it before, Freddie, you worked, like in the past now, also in, the fintech space, in the finance space, like even people working in that field don't give a shit, honestly, how money is created. The only thing they care about is how do we get it for free, essentially, and how can we make a yield on it? That's all they want to do.
Oh, yeah, very, very much so. In fact, I think from my own personal experience, and probably should say here, I worked in the city for 12 years and I've worked in fintech and startups for 4 or 5 now. So a reasonably lengthy career. I completely understand why people in the TradFi world don't give a shit about it, because they're doing very well with the current system. And I mentioned earlier, I didn't meet my first IRL Bitcoiner until 2019. I'd spent most of the previous 5 or 6 years being relentlessly abused by my friends for being interested in this weird internet money that was a scam, was tulips, was going to zero. I've got WhatsApp chats going back to I think the first time I was abused about it was like summer 2016 with some of my mates. We try and meet up at least once a year, and they're all economists from university and now working banks. And they're like, why are you interested in this weird bullshit thing? It's going to go to zero. And then occasionally, when the hype cycle happens and the price spikes, you get texts saying, "Oh, how's your Bitcoin doing?" And so, have you sold? Well, no, obviously I haven't sold. I don't want more fiat. Also, there's all kinds of capital gains tax issues you're going to get into there. So obviously no one ever sells, and also you point out that if I had any Bitcoin, I almost certainly would have lost it in an unfortunate maritime-related accident. So I don't know what you're talking about anyway. But I mean, on the more serious point, I do feel some sympathy for people who work in the TradFi world, because there's no need for them to know about it, and their system is working perfectly well for them. A lot of my friends have done very well for themselves and own multiple houses and send their children to very expensive schools. So they do all that without Bitcoin. Why do they care?
Yeah, that's a very good point. If it's not broken for them, why would they even bother even wrapping their head around something as complicated as Bitcoin, when the easiest thing to do really is just to default to the FUD that you might have read one day in the New York Times or something. Yeah, I think you're right in the sense that it was the same for me, Freddie, with the whole environmental side of things. It took me, I think one of the sticking points for me was, okay, it's perfect, but it's the enormous amount of energy it uses and the environment impact of that. And that was really one of the bigger hurdles for me to sort of wrap my head around. But when that veil drops and then you see the how the world operates in relation to energy and how the impact of the environment is in relation to that, I think that's a difficult one well, personally for me to overcome, and I'm sure a lot of other people. And this is, I think, where you're going to be facing quite a lot of difficulties. Being in the Bitcoin Institute, is people will not get it, and it's trying to articulate in a way where people can get it as quick as possible without actually losing the value of the message. I don't know if that is something that you're sort of grappling with yourself, Freddie.
Yeah, very true. Some of this I think boils down to sound bites. Bitcoin is a zero emissions industry. Not a single atom of carbon dioxide has ever been emitted by a Bitcoin miner, full stop. The carbon emissions come from electricity generation. And I think I'd make 2 points there. Firstly, no one in any other sphere is required to justify energy consumption. We don't say that people are not allowed to turn on their lights at home or use tumble dryers or light up their Christmas lights. If you've paid for your energy, you should be able to use it, full stop, if you live in a free society. And then I think that the second leap is what we're seeing happening in the industry now with voices like Margot Paez and Troy Cross and David Batten. It's a leap beyond just getting to the point where you say this use of energy is good because it secures this global monetary network that is free and available for everyone to use and join. You then take a second leap, which is, I think, even harder for some people to take, which is that this industry has certain characteristics that make it an extraordinarily good participant in the build-out of a renewable and sustainable grid, or in burning methane from old oil fields or old coal plants or from landfill gas. So this is an industry that has a capability to become carbon negative, and not because people have any particular ideology. It's simply down to self-interest. It is in the commercial interest of Bitcoin miners to find the cheapest available energy. And that is often energy that no one else wants to use. Oh, hey presto, we're sucking up lots of methane that was otherwise going to the atmosphere. And methane, as we know, is 80 times worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. And this doesn't require you to be a good person. You can be the biggest bastard in the world. And you can want to make as much money as you want from mining. And you just happen, it's like, I was on a call this morning, we were talking about the emergent properties of Bitcoin mining as an industry. One of the emergent properties is that you can accidentally become carbon negative by being a bastard. I mean, I absolutely love that.
Imagine explaining this to a Labour Party member, but that's a whole different discussion.
It's hard, isn't it? But mate, I try and explain it to my wife, who wishes I would stop talking about Bitcoin. And I mean,
Oh, you too.
yeah. Oh, it's so bad, isn't it? But there are two really big leaps there. Leap one is understanding it's not necessarily a bad use of energy, and then leap two is, oh my God, this is actually the best possible use of energy in these contexts and in this way, because of the incidental benefits that it has.
Do you think? So we established before, Freddie, that you have an interest in like tinkering, trying to find stuff out. Do you think your uprising in Africa is also a big influence in this? Because you've been around the world.
Yeah, so just as context, I sort of grew up. I grew up in the Middle East and Southern Africa. My dad was in the British Council, which if people don't know, they were sort of like the cultural wing of the British presence abroad, not quite like the embassy, but affiliated with them. So I lived in Syria as a very young kid, left just before I was 7, and then moved to Zimbabwe when I was 8, and spent most of my childhood there. And I think that's a really good point to raise, Joel, both from, I think, the tinkering point of view and also maybe understand there's a bit of overlap with understanding how collapsing currencies affect you. And harking back to my economist friends that I was at university with, I think one of the reasons it was potentially easier for me to understand Bitcoin than it would be for them is because I had actually lived through and not to say that this was a better or worse experience than theirs, but I had lived through societies with collapsing money and capital controls. And I say this quite a lot, but if I have to explain Bitcoin to you, you probably don't need it yet. People who need it understand it. And if you don't understand it, that's no judgment on you. It's probably simply that you just haven't had a need for it yet. The tinkering in Zimbabwe, I think, is a really good point. If you talk to any Zimbabwean, you at some point you'll probably hear them say, "Don't worry, we'll make a plan." I think it might originally have been a South African saying, but Zimbabweans are always very keen on making a plan. And growing up in a country like that, and it's suffering a lot more than it used to now. People are having to sink boreholes in their gardens. They're having to stockpile diesel at home. Even in South Africa, the electricity grid is collapsing to the point where there are rolling blackouts because the grid can't cope anymore. South Africa is a much richer country than Zimbabwe. Zim shouldn't be suffering those kind of economic collapse. But I think for people who grew up in Zimbabwe or people in Argentina right now, or people in the Lebanon, or people in Nigeria, if your currency is devaluing, if you're losing 70-80% against the US dollar every year, then Bitcoin makes perfect sense. You can put money into something that, yes, it's wildly, the fluctuations are crazy, but if your currency year on year loses 70%, then it makes a lot more sense.
And I was just about to say, I mean, if the media does something very well, they always focus on the downturns of Bitcoin, which happen every 4 years, just to be keep my media friends in check. And if you compare that 70% drawdown compared to, like you said, 80, 90, I mean, we heard Anita Posch last week in Prague where she spoke about a 400% inflation in, what was it, Ian, 2 or 3 years, something like this?
3 years, yeah.
3 years. This is immense. To them, Bitcoin is peanuts, and it is actually saving even in a bear market. So just to put that in perspective, if you actually experience this real time, you sort of see how innovative people are. Because I guess, how did you manage to preserve your family savings? Or do you remember when you were living in these times?
Yeah, so for some of the time we were there, my dad was earning in sterling. So, and I think that exemplifies a lot of the drive from countries like Zim. So there's always among people there, if it's at all possible for you to get hard currency, you try and get hard currency. So we went through various periods of usage of the US dollar, and obviously my dad being paid in sterling, converting to some dollars was very helpful. But he retired in 1989, and then we spent the rest of the time we lived in Zim with my dad earning local currency, and that was a big sea change of the family. So, and I remember how noticeable it was that we suddenly felt very poor. he had been earning sterling up till 89, and then suddenly, bam, he's earning some dollars. And it was hard to get hold of hard currency, and everyone may want sterling or dollars. No one wants Zim dollars. And that becomes a running theme when people leave the country, or when people try to get their money out when they finally leave. And I think this is, again, sort of returning to the Bitcoin point. Hard money drives out soft. People want to get hold of something that is. It may be devaluing. Yes, we know the US dollar is not immune to devaluation, but it's not devaluing at 80, 90% a year. And I think I saw that in real time with people trying to get hold of hard currency in Zim. And I think everyone in countries experiencing the same kind of monetary devaluation is seeing the same thing now. But with Bitcoin, we know the monetary premium that was put up on Bitcoin recently in Nigeria. I think, wasn't it trading at 20-30% premium? Don't quote me on that. My figures are likely to be wrong. But I remember there was an enormous premium in it last year.
I think at times 45% or something.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. But
and
to be honest, we had Mary from Nigeria on, and she explained to us that a part of it was sort of black market forces against a very cash-heavy society. So the cash people were trying to prevent people from getting cash, and the black market forces went, well, there's a premium on that, so that huge gap opened up. But yeah, crazy. Like, you had to pay almost 50% more just to get a trade done,
because you're trying to buy the cash on it. And then the capital controls point. You probably heard my silly story about getting our cash out. We you know the story. So we sold our house. We were sort of planning to come back to the UK to go to university. I was the eldest of 4 children. My brother's 10 years younger than me. And so we sold our house, and then we did what a lot of Zimbos do. You buy a big car and you drive it across the border. So we bought this 1976 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, absolutely gorgeous piece of machinery, and drove it out through South Africa and drove 2,500 miles to Cape Town. Fantastic journey across the Drakensberg, down the Garden Route, through the Boer War battlefields, the Zulu battlefields, Isandlwana, Rorke's Drift, down to Cape Town, put it on a boat, and then sailed up to the UK.
Awesome. That's great. I was just thinking of the time when you were talking about your dad converting from being paid in sterling into local currency. And did you get a sense of injustice about that at all? Like when things started to, the impact of that you started to feel when that happened, was that sort of like the motivation for you to sort of try to get into lobbying and into things like policy and things like that? Was there any motivation there behind that?
I think you probably highlights quite an important point there, Ian. I've always been really upset by unfairness.
Mm.
And I think this is something you mentioned, Anita Posh. This is something she highlights so well. Bitcoin is, one of the wonderful things about it is that it's a fair system. And when we're kids, we're all upset by unfairness. One of the first things you get shouted at by your children is, it's not fair, it's not fair.
Yeah.
But somehow as we get older, we tend to lose that. And I think that actually this is a great point here. This is probably where the two interests kind of melt. One of the reasons I love Bitcoin so much is because I feel it is fair in a way that the existing financial system is not. It's very, very easy if you sound like me and went to the same university as me and have the same kind of professional background to go into the system which stacks the cards hugely in your favor, and you can go and work at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, and those are respectable careers to have. Goldman Sachs was a client of mine for a long time. I did a lot of very interesting work for them, and actually a lot of the most brilliant people I ever worked with were at Goldman Sachs. So, that's. But the system in which that operates is not a fair one, and particularly in terms of how easy it is for money to be created either at central bank level or by commercial banks, and then to be, the private equity and venture capital market, by way of example, I don't know how much time I've got to delve into it, so please stick two fingers up at me if you'd like me to shut up.
No, go for it.
The entire model of private equity, and I've worked in this industry for a long time, is, when you think about it, slightly monstrous. You have very, very good companies, let's say, working. Peter Express is an example I often use. So Peter Express was a good business and has been going for a long time, was acquired by private equity, I think about 2006, 2007. And if your listeners are familiar, the way a private equity fund works is a fund will be set up and will go out and raise money from what are called the LPs. So those are investors who are, often insurance funds, pension funds, ultra high net worth individuals. And a fund, let's call it PE Fund 1, will be created. They will raise a certain amount of money, and then the managers of the fund need to go out and deploy that capital. So they need to go and find targets to invest. And the way private equity worked in 2006, 2007 was that the PE fund would come in and they'd buy a business like Peter Express with roughly using 10% of their own fund money and like 90% of money from a bank. So the lending bank would essentially create that loan money, and that would be lent to the special purpose vehicle, which would then buy Peter Express. Back in the day, it was called Gondola. So that was the SPV that bought Peter Express. And then the great thing about that structure was that firstly, the PE fund only put in like 10% of the equity strip. 90% of it was newly created money, created by a lending bank, and it was secured against the assets of the group. So the security was Peter Express, which is the business that you'd bought. And the reason Peter Express has been in trouble again and again and again across the intervening period, and this is all available online if you care to read about it, is because the debt burden servicing that debt is absolutely enormous and eats up almost all of Peter Express's profit. But it's great for the private equity company because in 3 to 5 years' time, they sell it off either to a trade buyer or via IPO, and they make absolute bank because they only put in 10% of the equity. And they make a gigantic return on that small strip of equity that they put in. Peter Express, the group itself, is still burdened with that enormous debt burden, and they haven't been able to make any freaking profit. So I mean the whole financial engineering industry seems, I probably shouldn't say this on a podcast because it means I'm unlikely to work in that industry again. But it's pretty monstrous. And I think in summary, you've got an entire industry that relies upon putting in money to very, very good businesses, and then essentially overburdening them with enormous amounts of debt that they will never be able to pay off, which is kind of a metaphor for our entire economy, really.
Yeah, the term house. The house always wins comes to mind right now.
Yeah. Well, you said it much more succinctly than I did. It took me about 10 minutes to say that.
And I can sense the frustration in your voice as well, the injustice of it all. And is this why you're now sort of driving the Bitcoin Policy Institute to try to sort of put signal out there about Bitcoin and sort of integrate that into an unjust system somehow? I think,
fundamentally, that's why. I mean, I feel that being involved in Bitcoin is the way I can do the most good for the most number of people in the shortest amount of time. And it sounds silly if you come at that statement cold, but if you understand why our current financial system is so broken and so heavily stacked in, as you say, in favor of the house, Bitcoin is not just a reinvention of it's just not massaging the existing system. It's a completely new system in its own right. And coming back to Anita's point, it's fair. The protocol treats everyone the same. It doesn't matter if you're a billionaire. It doesn't matter if you're just buying your first Satoshi. It treats you exactly the same. And the protocol doesn't care when you broadcast a transaction. It doesn't care how much you're sending, where you're sending it to, or what your purposes are. And I think the other thing that appeals to me about it so much is that no matter how much Bitcoin you have, you can't change the rules.
Yep.
And that's just game changing for me.
And I guess what's amazing is, obviously everyone has different experiences. So, me growing up in Switzerland, I was always under the impression, democracy is sort of a birth given right. We do live in a democracy, and like these people at the top surely do the best in our interest. And just through living in that period, you sort of realize, well, at times there's not much of a difference between the UK and Zimbabwe, probably. Like, yeah, one country's maybe more fucked in terms of the standard of their currency and all of these things. But at the end of the day, this whole democracy thing that we've been sold, in theory it works, but we don't have the tools to protect ourselves. And here comes this invention, discovery, whatever you want to call it, in 08, 09, where a guy literally, or a group, I think, everyone has their different opinion who Satoshi is, sat down and went like, right, let's combine all of the last 60 years with like cryptology knowledge, what money is, what sound money is, the Austrian school of economics, and all of these principles into one thing. And to actually get this thing, guess what? You have to put work in. It's not just that you can hit the button or turn on the machine and print it. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, that's amazing. And if you then go a step further to get into the CBDC discussion, at the end of the day, in the current financial system, if they really want to fuck you over, they can shut down your bank account, they can shut down access to the whole system. Just look at whether you're in favor or not of the whole Russia-Ukraine thing. They basically cut people off in Russia who probably were not interested in a war or whatever was going on, just because they had that passport or that virtual line on a card that existed somewhere. And with Bitcoin, yes, in theory, centralized exchanges, nation states can blacklist an address. But guess what? The protocol doesn't give a shit. So it's not just fuck you money. It literally is fuck you technology to say, if you play by the rules, you can do whatever you want. I don't want to drop another F-bomb.
Don't worry. I have steel ears. No, but no, completely agree. And, obviously a good deal of my spare time at the moment is spent on doing policy work with Bitcoin Policy UK. So, some of your listeners may be aware of some of the stuff that we've done so far. So we've been feeding as much as we can into the various consultations that are ongoing, to the Treasury, to the FCA, to the Bank of England, to Parliament as well. And with a degree of sympathy, because these politicians and regulators at the moment, they are starting from a very, very low point of understanding. Initially, a lot of people will think this is just bullshit. Why should I care? Why is this important? And then you go through the period of thinking, oh, this is all crypto. And, we were probably all there ourselves. Ian, I know you've already mentioned you were. I was really interested in 2017 by the idea of Ethereum and the world computer. Silicon Valley, the show Silicon Valley? Yeah, so I thought there were a lot of echoes of what Ethereum might have done in a different universe there. We want this decentralized world computer that no one can control, that you can run anything on. I've not heard much about that narrative recently. That may have died? I don't know. Maybe that's no longer a thing.
I haven't heard of it. I tend to I didn't look back.
And I went through it. It took me quite a long time to understand why all other cryptocurrencies were pointless, at least from the perspective of what I was interested in, which is fixing money. I think Bitcoin has of everything that exists in this sphere, Bitcoin has got the best chance of separating money and state. Could Ethereum become a completely neutral, non-state money? Absolutely not, because we would know where it's run. We know who controls it, and I think it's proof of stake because you just shot yourself in the freaking foot.
Yeah,
and it's not just a proof of stake thing. It's not the foundation. With the current SEC charges, there have been emails popping up where like, hey, let's ask this guy responsible for this decentralized network. Yeah. And you always have that ultrasound money, right? Like burn 0.11% of your unknowingly ever increasing money supply, and call it ultrasound money. But the main thing for me is they've been captured by the big banks. You do know, if you read like Laura Schink's book, or also if you go back way into the history of Ethereum, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, they were sort of involved there. There's a reason why Ethereum is sort of very close with institutions like Consensus and these ones, because they're the ones providing software to banks for private blockchains, which essentially are just a bit more modern version of a database, but they control what happens on that database, and they call it blockchain because it's hip and sound, and probably a couple of LPs will invest into it. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, we're like, yes, this looks very nice, very organized, big banks behind it, that always builds trust for normal people. And you sort of have the lunatics who essentially wear the same underwear for 2 weeks to buy more sats. Obviously, there will be quite a big discrepancy there. But if you would have to put money on something that works and that enables everyone, I think the lunatics with the same underwear are probably your best shot.
Yeah, completely right. I want my network to be able to survive a state-level attack, full stop. And if it can't, then it doesn't deserve to survive. And so far, Bitcoin has. I'm a realist. If Bitcoin can be stopped, then it doesn't deserve to survive. It must be unstoppable. Which is why I enjoy hearing about potential weaknesses and criticisms of it. And it was one of the reasons I found the recent ordinal kerfuffle so interesting. I thought, you have you had
Udi's attempts at breaking Bitcoin.
Bitcoin didn't break. It kept working.
It did,
And also, that actually gave me some hope about what happens after 2140, because the security budget question is something that I thought was a genuine attack vector. But I mean, God knows what's going to happen in 2140. I don't know if we'll survive that long.
Probably not. But our kids and grandkids or whatever will. And I think what the best case scenario was with ordinals is the system worked as it intended to be. Miners were able to pick up fees, which they were not for a long time now at the bear market. Yeah. Obviously, they're going to promote ordinals because that's how they're going to keep paying the bills and keep expanding their operation. And on the other end of things, yes, you did have maybe higher fees on the main chain, but guess what? We do have layer solutions now, and I bet we'll see probably third layers, different layer 2s other than the Lightning Network, just to counteract this thing. And I don't know if you've seen it, Freddie. I can then for sure link it in the show notes and send it to you later. Giacomo Zucco did a great talk about why ordinals are retarded. I think that was the title. And he sort of highlighted... I'll send it to you later on. It's really cool. It's a funny talk because Giacomo just does an amazing stuff. Yeah. And he showed the idea behind ordinals is not something new. It already existed. And it's not like Taproot and SegWit, for that matter, broke Bitcoin. It's just an improvement to the software, and the masses will decide where we're going to go. And guess what? For now, some of them like ordinals, happy if they pick it up. TikTok next block, it still works. So it's not that it breaks. And I think looking from the outside in, if I were to work at the Bank of England, for example, and I get contacted by BP UK, and I sort of have to look at this thing hang on a minute, there are people trying to break your stuff. It still works. It is energy wasteful, let's call it, at least in their eyes. But somehow you manage to get it going, and you now want to go up against us, we who sort of have control over everything in the system. And I think it is hard for them to understand why a CBDC is potentially so dangerous, and why Bitcoin isn't to be treated as a currency or as something stable, because again, they profited from the system, and inevitably they will profit if they adopt the CBD standard in the future as well.
Well, maybe spending a couple of minutes on CBDCs, if I may.
Yeah, please.
I think historically, a lot of the current central bank kerfuffle around CBDCs is actually because the central banks are all fighting the last war. So if you remember when Facebook came out with its Libra DM proposals, the central banks all shit their pants because Facebook is starting from a massive first mover advantage of God knows how many billion users. And central banks suddenly realize, oh shit, if these guys bring out a coin, they will be able to completely disintermediate us. So ironically, although a lot of us Bitcoiners are very agitated by central bank actions. It stems largely from the Facebook idiocy from 2 or 3 years ago. So what we're seeing them doing now is really a reaction to what was happening in 17, 18, 19, and is now completely out of date. So if you want to go and read the Bank of England's proposals for the CBDCs, they're extraordinarily confused in some ways. The House of Lords' own committee report, which we referenced in our response to the Bank of England, comes out quite strongly against them and says, we think they're a solution in search of a problem. In the UK, at least, banking works relatively well. Most of our money is already electronic. We don't see a use case for a CBDC that isn't already perfectly well met by our existing banking system. It's daft. Sorry, John.
Just to add on your point, like I read about a leaked, like I look at this a bit as a former journalist, a bit like, okay, leaked, like you got a source at like the ECB or whatever, probably paid someone off with a hooker. They had a leaked document from the ECB stating that the CBDC Euro version essentially will also be offline spendable. And I kind of went like, hang on a minute, like we could do this a few different ways. Like we can issue bonds. You can then redeem these bonds in shops if you want to. Physical coins, like, and to be honest, if they think about crypto tokens, it would fit perfectly if they would actually issue tokens for that as well. Or the last thing was like, you'll get a bank account with the central bank directly and you get like a debit card and basically your CBDCs are on there as well. But then I went like, so they want to do a digital thing and they want to still keep it offline. How is that any different to what we currently face, other than the central bank can essentially get around commercial banks and just dictate our everyday lives? So do you think this uncertainty and this not knowing is really because initially they still have the information and research based on 2017, 2018, or do these people really not know how modern financial tools work essentially and think that this is the solution?
I think probably more of the former. And I think you also again have to recognize that we're dealing with people who think they suddenly have to produce a digital asset because someone else is doing it, not because they've got a good idea or they've got a problem they want to solve. We said this in our evidence. I think a lot of this is based on a misunderstanding, and to the extent that CBDCs are a pushback against Bitcoin, they represent a misunderstanding that people like Bitcoin because it's digital. That is not why people like Bitcoin. Almost no one that you speak to is a Bitcoiner will say that. People like Bitcoin because it cannot be debased or diluted or confiscated by a central bank. They like Bitcoin because if I want to send you, Ian, some Bitcoin or you, Joel, I can do it now, and no one, not even God himself, can stop. However, if I'm using a CBDC and I have said something politically offensive or that the regime of the day deems inappropriate, it's very, very easy for them to turn off my access to finance. And I return a lot to the idea that the freedom to transact is what actually one of the most fundamental freedoms, although it's not obvious. People think of human rights and they think, the right to free speech or the right, to practice whatever religion you want or to not to live in fear that your sexuality or gender identity will be used against you politically. But the freedom to transact is actually just as fundamental as any of these things. If you were to go out and you were trying to buy food or water or shelter and your bank card wasn't working, you're fucking homeless. Have you ever read Neverwhere, Neil Gaiman's book about London Below?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't, no, but I love Neil Gaiman, so thank you for the recommendation.
Oh, if you like Gaiman, you'll love it.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
It's one of his early ones. I think he wrote in the 80s, I think, originally as a radio script, actually, or maybe TV. I won't spoil the story for you, but right at he's got this concept of London above, which is where we live, and London below, which is where the people go when they fall through the cracks. And it's like this magical world underneath London where there really is an angel called Islington, and there are terrifying black friars, and there's a massive guy with a hammer called Hammersmith. Anyway, it's very, very cool. You must totally read it.
Most definitely. Thank you.
At the beginning of it, there's a guy who falls through the cracks. There's a guy called Richard, the main character. He suddenly finds that his key doesn't work in his door and his bank card doesn't work, and that he becomes invisible. He's effectively unpersoned. And
Right.
that, I think, is, if you zero in on it, that's why I feel CBDCs have such dangerous potential, because they give the central bank and the government the ability to unperson you. And if your bank account doesn't work, and if you can't pay your phone bill or your heating bill or your water bill, you're you're homeless on the streets. You're totally fucked. And the cost to the government of fucking you is extremely low.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have Bitcoin, the cost to the government of fucking you is, God knows how many exahashes of actual work.
Yeah. What with in terms of CBDCs, is it a realistic fear that they could lock us out on the on and off ramps to buying Bitcoin? Is that a reasonable fear?
I think it's a sensible fear. But at the same time, if you have some Bitcoin and I have some CBDC and I want to exchange it, then how do they stop that?
Yeah.
Provided that CBDC is exchangeable peer to peer, then I don't think that they can make it more difficult, but they can't stop it. And as we know, black markets exist in every single country in the world for every single commodity. Rules never completely kill an industry. They could make it more difficult. But I'm hoping that by the time CBDCs become sufficiently entrenched, Bitcoin will be so similarly entrenched in our energy infrastructure and in our general commercial day-to-day transactions that it won't matter.
Yeah.
If we live in a world where every single wind farm is co-located with a Bitcoin miner and to act as demand response and a battery to accommodate power that isn't required for the demand response, then it just becomes boring. It's part of the infrastructure.
And I guess to me personally, it's not only the whole big if is like, can the government build a digital native experience to, basically get, whatever, like 5 billion people on board if we leave out sort of the unbanked and all of the maybe less remote areas who don't have good internet access. And even then, like, does it work constantly? Does it integrate with all of the different currencies? So there's a big if. But for me personally, looking at history, whenever an empire failed, it didn't fail because inevitably there was an uprising, or like, look at the French Revolution, for example. Yeah, they beheaded their king, and guess what? 15 years later, they had another dictator sending them into wars every 2 weeks, essentially. So it's not really the uprising by the plebs, if you want to call it so, but it's really the fact that history hasn't been kind to people who play God. And if you try and manipulate money, which is the purest form of good we need in everyday life, I needed to pay for my coffee, my bills, essentially everything. If you want to take that away, I guess at one point people will find an avenue, and we already see it with statements by, Christine Lagarde, who says if there is another alternative to the current rails, they will use it. And it's like you said, Freddie, at the end of the day, black markets pop up. Funnily enough, if they maybe had less regulation, you wouldn't have so many black markets, right? So they kind of shoot themselves in the foot wherever they go. And I guess as Bitcoin, the best thing to do is obviously fight against it, but be open enough and give possibilities to people who are not yet in the know what that alternative is. Because it really isn't that hard once you get these core Bitcoin principles and get on board, essentially.
Yeah, completely right. So much of it is about, I think, people coming to it gently. And, Bitcoin is not, one of the lovely things about it, it's not a compulsory system. No one is forced to use it. Everyone who's using it today has chosen to adopt it voluntarily. For we all have our different reasons for doing so. Some are you a cypherpunk? Do you hate modern monetary theory? Do you fear inflation? Do you currency debasement, controlled censorship? Many different reasons. But it's really a fascinating period of history to live through. We're watching something monetize from absolute zero in real time. Hard money drives out soft. Whether there's no advertising budget, there's no CEO, there's no marketing team. It's something that people have freely chosen, and it's one of the most wonderful things about the system.
It forces you in a way to really take a deep look at not only money but yourself as well, and how our whole system is interconnected. And I find it forever fascinating. And Freddie, thank you for allowing us down your Bitcoin rabbit hole and showing us how you got into it. Is there anything you want to say or add to the podcast before we leave now? Is there anything we forgot to ask you that you would like to say?
Well, I think just a final thank you from me. I love chatting with you guys. It's a real honor to come on the podcast. So thank you very much for having me on. And then to all of the listeners, we're a young organization, Bitcoin Policy UK. We're self-funded. We're all volunteers. So if you would like to get involved or to follow us on Twitter, we'd love to have you as a follower and love to have you generate the support of the community. We're very open to feedback, and we're still formulating our policy responses in the way that we want to go about negotiating with regulators, with politicians, and so on. So any support from the community would be great. We are also involved in fundraising to have a couple of small proof of concept mines. So if anyone's interested, do have a look on our website or on Giza Fund as well. And generally speaking, if you have opinions, get in touch. We're keen to listen to them. And chaps, thanks so much for having me on. It's been a tremendous pleasure.
Thank you. And we'll put all the information in the show notes to how to contact the Bitcoin Policy UK, and everything will be in these show notes to make it easy for everyone to find you guys. So thank you, Freddie.
Thank you so much.
Where's the best place to find you, Freddie? Is it Twitter or LinkedIn?
I'm probably Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't use it that often. I'm at Freddie New on Twitter.
Nice, short and
You're
simple.
about to have a new follower.
I think I follow you both already, but
Oh no, yep. There we are. Followed back.
Ian was Ian just experienced the uncomfortable thing you usually have at conferences and such, where they go like, "Oh, I'm following you." They kind of go like, "I do too."
Yeah, that happened to me in Prague. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
oh,
Cool.
Lovely.
Take care, Freddie. Take care.
Look after yourselves. Thanks so much, guys. Bye bye.
Pleasure.